Welcome back again to Lecture 3 on Sociological Research Methods. Before this, we covered the ontology and epistemology of sociology, and so now, based on that, we move on to look at sociology's favorite methods. In general, we'll start off by defining what research methods are, and we'll look at a variety of research methods that are not only unique to sociology, but can be used in a variety of social sciences, and maybe even in the sciences. As always, we start off with basic definitions of key terms. So when we talk about research here, we are referring to a process of investigating something or some phenomenon systematically. Therefore, to specify further, sociological research would be investigating social life using sociological theories and methods. Therefore, what we collect is called data, which is the information collected by researchers. Data could take many forms. It could be experimental data, like what scientists record in laboratory experiments. For example, they could test things like temperature. But data could really include all sorts of information, including people's demographics, age, height, weight, location of residence, etc. But it really could take any form. It could even be patterns of behavior that are not noticeable to individuals themselves. For example, when do people tend to move together as a crowd? For example, when crossing the road, we all have to cross at the same time. So data is not always something that people consciously are aware of. And today, of course, we have the issue of big data, or rather a trend, where this could include harvesting a lot of data from websites or the whole of the internet. This is not necessarily put out there by individuals as a source of data deliberately, but it becomes data because it's a type of information that's useful to researchers to identify patterns of human behavior. Therefore, we have to think of how to plan and organize our research in order to collect this data. So the way we plan and organize research would be the research design. And the actual methods you use to collect the data, or the tools used to collect the data, would be your methods. So this could be a survey. For example, we always talk about surveys in sociology. The survey itself is an instrument or a tool to capture the data. That would be what we call a method. But when we talk about methodology is, again, from the keywords method and logos, the study of, just like in sociology. So methodology is the study of methods, and in this case, it's the study of sociological research methods. So when you have a methodology chapter in your thesis, this really means that you have to first elaborate what's your ontology, epistemology, and how this, in turn, influence your choice of method later on. Your choice of type of data or evidence that you are going to collect to either prove or disprove your hypothesis. So how do we maintain or make sure that there is quality in research? So we come to a few techniques here that researchers often practice in order to make sure that the data they collect is valid and therefore useful. First of all is standardization, which means to make something procedural or systematic rather than on hearsay. Instead of just talking about the latest social issues in a coffee shop with friends, we are now going to actually come up with a research question, and then with an appropriate research design, a way of collecting data, and then we're going to standardize this. To go deeper, standardization includes three main elements here, which are reliability, transparency, and validity. First of all, reliability refers to the issue of whether the research is repeatable. This is most often observed in scientific experiments, where you can repeat the same experiment again and again. For example, in the study of vaccines and whether there are any side effects, they could repeat the same experiment again and again on a large group of individuals. So in other words, we're trying to see whether we will get the same results. If we get the same results, it's known as being reliable. This refers to the extent to which repeated measurements using the same method produces the same results. So it's also commonly used in quantitative research, where social sciences are concerned. Next on, we come to transparency. So this basically means we make our entire methods known to the reader. So in other words, the quality of being see-through. It means that the researcher has shown exactly how the research was done. For example, in a study using an interview, the researcher should also provide the list of actual questions used, mention how they were asked, the number of people interviewed, etc. So that's why when you do any interviews or surveys, you are usually required to put them in the appendix of your thesis, and you'll also have to discuss this in your methodology chapter as to you have to explain the rationale for designing those questions in particular, selecting them. And of course, if you were to use statistical methods, you'd also have to explain why and which type of statistical method you're using. And then also to elaborate on how you actually carried out the actual question and answer and whether there were any challenges faced in the whole process. So that would be transparency. And then we come to something called validity. In sociology, this has a more specific meaning than the word valid in common use. It refers to how justified are we in drawing conclusions from a set of data. In other words, is this really representing what it is supposed to represent? Are you really looking at the accurate phenomenon or the right sample from the right population? So there are also three types of validity. Firstly, construct validity. It basically refers to the accuracy of the variables used. For example, if you're looking at maybe a large-scale study of human behavior, or perhaps you're looking at whether poverty has increased because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you might want to look at a few variables that indicate poverty, like the person's source of income, the person's daily expenditure, or indicators of income level, like whether they have a house, electricity, running water, and so on and so forth. So would these indicators be valid in measuring something like poverty? That would be a question on construct validity. And then we come on to internal validity, which refers to how justified are we in drawing a conclusion regarding the relationship between two or more variables, between two or more constructs, in other words. So if we were to say that having access to electricity indicates a person's socioeconomic status, would this be the right relationship to look at? Or maybe you want to add a few more variables, like access to clean water, to education, access to internet. So would these truly be valid or accurate variables to indicate a person's socioeconomic background? And then we have one more type of validity, which is ecological validity, which basically is the question of, does the research truly reflect the actual reality of social life? For example, is this generalizable to more than just your sample? If you were studying a very unique group, maybe it's a group that lives in a very remote village, and you find that in terms of poverty, it has increased recently. But then can you also extrapolate this finding to people who live in the urban areas or in the rest of the country or in the rest of the world? Or is it very particular because this particular group of people are living in somewhere very remote? So the next step here would be planning and choice, which is to think about how you would actually do the research when it comes to research design. Sometimes we all come up with interesting research topics, but when we actually want to carry it out, we are at a loss. You might ask something like, how do I even start? This topic is so interesting to me, but where do I even begin? So first of all, it's always useful to come up with the basic concept of what your research is all about. In other words, it's the entire idea or ontology behind your research, the driving force behind why you want to discover this particular aspect of human behavior in the first place. So concepts here are defined as theoretical categories used to describe and explain the social world. These are clearly defined categories given to aspects of the social world that have significant common features. Again, for example, like poverty, crime, or maybe, let's say, discrimination, or anything else. So we can derive these from the classical sociological concerns, because if we look back at the classical sociologists, they were in fact very much concerned with things like the social problems brought about by the first industrial revolution, like crime, poverty, and inequality. Or you could also take more of a, either structural functionalist or social conflict, or even symbolic interactionist perspective, which looks at more micro level, more individualistic perspectives of human behavior. If you recall, there could be macro sociological concepts that come from structural functionalism and social conflict, and of course you have the more individualist perspectives. So these two could be sources for your concepts. And to indicate the existence of these concepts, we need something called indicators. Indicators are like the evidence that something exists. So this would be the tool that you would use to measure a concept. This process is called operationalizing. Operationalizing means a way of measuring. So indicators are tools used to measure concepts. For example, if the concept is poverty, the indicator would be the aspect that confirms whether poverty exists. In other words, it's like the proof for your epistemology. So these would be things like monthly income, number of meals per day, whether the person has access to electricity, school, and so on. And so further on from there, we have descriptive and explanatory research designs. So the difference here is that descriptive research designs are the types of research design where you are trying to construct a much clearer and more comprehensive picture of how something works, often on the basis of earlier exploratory studies. For example, it could be a study of social change, which asks how family life, work, and leisure have changed over the last 25 years. So it's like you're trying to tell the story of the big picture without coming up with any general laws, if you recall how the positivists tended to do that. But then you could also take a more explanatory version of research design, which is where you ask why something happens and tries to identify possible causal mechanisms. So this is more in the direction of the positivist type of research, which tries to come up with general laws. For example, you might want to test a theory that youth today have shorter attention spans than youth 25 years ago. And therefore, you might want to form a theory about why this is the case. So you ask a very specific question. You ask why youth today might have shorter attention spans than youth 25 years ago. And you look for a very specific answer, like a particular construct or variable. And then you define a relationship around it, or a general law. Next on, we differentiate between quantitative and qualitative research designs. Now again, this is not to say one is better than the other. It depends on the kind of research question and the kind of concept or indicator that you're trying to look for. So it would result in different types of data, of course. It is of course not to say that only science can use quantitative methods. It's perfectly okay to use them too in the social sciences. So quantitative methods have certain characteristics, which are it enables relationships between variables to be documented systematically. It is more likely to fulfill the key criteria of standardization, reliability, and transparency, which were the standardization aspects we just mentioned a while ago. Therefore, it gives data seemingly more authority. Especially when we publish this in the newspaper, we look at pie charts and so on and so forth, and the media tends to enjoy quoting these. But qualitative research also has its own strengths. It tends to be more ecologically valid because it tends to capture the actual lived experience or reality of the immediate respondents you're talking to. So it may not be able to be generalized across a large population, but it's definitely real enough with the particular sample you're studying. It also provides knowledge of how people behave in their natural contexts. So methods like ethnography, participant observation will be very much rich in this kind of information, and it keeps things very real. It's not something that you can easily summarize in a pie chart, but it's very much able to capture the nuances of the person's surroundings. So it enables researchers to explore people's experiences, and also, if you recall, to test the meanings behind their actions and how these meanings are attached to these actions and how these develop over time. So you'll be able to look at phenomenological aspects of people's behavior.